Being autistic means many things. Some we're okay with, some not so much. But making sense of it all in the world we live in today isn't easy. Just surviving as an autist can feel like a massive challenge, let alone thriving. But I can help you with both. The Autistic Triad of Distinction helps you understand who you are and take control of your future. In the last 2 videos, we explained what the Triad is, how I developed it, and what it can do for you. Today, I'll show it to you in action. I'm Quinn, and I'm autistic. Welcome to Autistic. The Autistic Triad of Distinction is the culmination of 40 years of study and investigation into what it means to be autistic and the impact our differences have on the paths available to us in life. It's helped me to cope with and often overcome some of the discontinuities, contradictions and frustrations of living in a world that isn't built for people like us. It allows me to understand myself and my interactions with others better, to make the most of my skills, compensate for my weaknesses, and to plan my life more confidently. Autistic people process the world differently from other folks, but our differences are almost always described from an observer's point of view. That doesn't help us much, just learning how other people feel impacted by us and their theories about why we do it. But what if we turn it around? Look at it from our point of view. That's where the Triad of Distinction comes from. The Triad helps us to protect ourselves, to better communicate, and to feel more assured in our interactions. It empowers us with self-knowledge and tools to shape our futures. There's plenty of material out there listing autistic deficits and failings, and no shortage of tips, tricks, and shortcuts to sidestep them. But even with the best of intentions, lists of handy hints are not helpful for everyone. Some of us need a deeper understanding. Some of us need to know the hows and whys so we can work out lasting solutions to real-world problems, not sticking plaster fixes from the soap opera world of generic advice. If that sounds like you, then my Triad of Distinction just might be what you've been looking for. All 3 leaves of the Triad of Distinction are relevant to all autistic people, but most of us find one kind of autistic stress, one leaf of the Triad, impacts our lives more than others. Are we an emotional autist, a sensory one, or are we more affected by our sense of veracity? All 3 impact on every one of us, but which one matters the most to you? The Triad will tell you. In the next half hour or so, I'll show you the Triad in action. I'll tell you a tale of my past, of a day burned into my memory in excruciating detail. One that I've relived in my mind more times than I could count, but it's also one that reveals a great deal about what it is that makes me autistic. I'm going to analyse that day and its explosive outcome through the lens of the Autistic Triad of Distinction. If you don't yet know what the Triad of Distinction is or where it came from, you ought to watch the 2 previous videos in this series. I'll link the playlist up above, which will bring you back to the beginning of this video after you've watched the first 2. The Triad is a 3-stage tool. We start with an analysis phase, followed by strategy, and then application. I'll give you a practical demo of the analysis phase today by diving deep into the weeds of an incident that occurred when I was but the tender age of 12 years old, about a year before I was diagnosed autistic. When it came to adapting my personal Triad system into a framework others could use for themselves, I hit a personal barrier very quickly. This analysis phase we're looking at today requires we use some kind of scoring system, but not everyone finds that as easy as it might sound, and I'm one of those people. We will need to judge how much we're impacted by things or how far our perceptions stray from the average. And for most folks, numbers or tokens are the easiest way to convey that information. But, like many easy communication skills, some autistic people, like myself, find that extremely difficult to do. Most people seem to be able to score their feelings or rank their opinions without a second thought, but for me and some of my neurodivergent friends, it can be a complicated challenge that might take us hours or days of deep thought. I can describe things verbally in the most exquisitely fine detail, but translating my florid epithets into numbers has always put my brain on the fritz. I've examined this difficulty of mine through the lens of the Triad, and I think I know why it is. But whilst I know I'm not alone, I don't know how many of you watching might share this particular quirk. If you find you have similar difficulties assigning a number to remembered feelings, physical or emotional, then let me know in the comments, because if there are enough of you wanting me to, I'll make a video on how I get round that problem sooner rather than later. You don't need numbers for this to work, though. You just need an internal sense of proportion to be able to build an understanding of how our individual autistic differences affect us in different ways and how those pressures can push us beyond our limits on their own or working together. I didn't need to use numbers myself until I put this together for other folks to use. When I use the Triad of Distinction personally, I still top things up in my mind, and I do frequently use pencil and paper to take notes, but when I explain it to others, numbers are by far the easiest system to work with. So, it's time for me to put my Jackanory hat on and tell you my story. I'll set the scene of a day long past when all those very specifically autistic pressures got the better of me, and I had an externalised stress event, a meltdown in the common parlance. Once I've aired all my dirty linen in front of you, I'll examine each significant moment through the lens of my Triad of Distinction to see what we can learn about why I melted down. The day in question is as fresh in my mind as yesterday. I clearly remember my side of it, what was said and done, movements, trajectories, sequences, and the things only I can know, like my feelings, motivations, and intent. As to the rest of it, what everybody else saw and thought, I relied on the witness accounts I was furnished with for years after, since all three family members who were present at the end never seemed to tire of reminding me about it. In 1983, I was an ardent Doctor Who fan. Nothing's changed there. This was the day I was due to receive my Doctor Who technical manual, which I'd pre-ordered in the post weeks previously. I was ridiculously excited for it, and I started camping out in the porch of our terraced house from about 5:30 a.m. to wait for the post. Our post usually arrived about 6:30 back then, so yes, I was way too early, and yes, I was chilly and uncomfortable, and I was acutely aware of it, but I wanted to be ready to tear that package open the moment it popped through the letterbox. I'd waited over a month and sent off my own money to get this, so no way was I hanging about. At 6 a.m, my dad got up to his normal routine of coffee, cigarette, then straight out the back door to get in his van. So I sat in the front porch unnoticed until about 7:45 when the mail finally arrived. Just brown window envelopes addressed to Mum and Dad, and no parcel containing a Doctor Who technical manual. I did not melt down, but I wasn't happy. Whilst I hid in the porch, I missed my turn in the bathroom, making me late for school before I'd even wheeled my bike out of the garage, and I knew there'd be another detention slip waiting when I got there. The school's main gates were already closed and locked by the time I arrived, so I had to get off my bike and walk it through the pedestrian entrance in a panic, but no meltdown yet. Bullying wasn't a daily occurrence for me, but on that day, some clever dick took it upon themselves to nick my lunch pack out of my school bag during a lesson in the morning and hoist it up the school flagpole. I was expected to either make a fool of myself trying to retrieve it or cry like a baby at the theft of my warm, sweaty luncheon meat sarnies. I didn't want to play that game again, so I left them all cackling in anticipation of the show to come, whilst I hid around the back of the games block, way off the beaten track. I stayed there for the rest of lunch and for the lesson that followed. I knew that if I skipped my final lesson, there would be letters sent home, so I shuffled back after break and walked into class like nothing had happened. Nonetheless, I got sent out of class within minutes for unrelated reasons, and had to stand out in the corridor until the end of the lesson. The staff were already wise to me fetching chairs in advance of being ejected from this particular class, and this teacher would sweep the corridor before my lessons to make sure I couldn't get comfortable when he inevitably booted me out. He appeared to be in a particularly mean mood that day, though. 5 minutes after throwing me out, he poked his head round the door to see me reading the paperback book that I kept in my blazer pocket for times like these. He grinned as he plucked it from my fingers. "You can pick this up from detention in, about 40 minutes. That turned the stress taps on hard, but still not enough to flood into a stress event. Not even the puncture I got in my bicycle tyre a mile from the school gates or the 5-mile urban trek to push my bike home from there tipped me over the edge. My autistic waters may well have been sloshing about by then, but they were still contained. I still had hope, you see. Back in those days, there was a second postal delivery on weekdays around midday. At least there was where we lived. I still had hope that when I got home, my technical manual might have arrived in the second post and my day wouldn't be a total wipeout. There was nothing waiting for me when I finally trudged in the door, a full hour later than I normally would. Mum confirmed to me there'd been no second post that day, and my heart sank. But that wasn't enough to tip me over. I was unhappy, though, so instead of going to watch telly like I normally would after school, I slunk up to my bedroom to wait for dinner time. I just wanted to be quiet and alone. It had been a bad day, and I couldn't even tell anyone the whole story because my parents would go mental if they knew I'd skipped a class. During dinner, my mum and dad had quizzed me about my day, and I'd been honest about it all, except for the skipping class bit. So I was quite surprised when I was clearing the dinner table afterwards, one of my regular chores, when my dad challenged me. "Who peed all over your chips then, son?" he asked. I knew he was talking to me, but I acted like I'd not heard. I'd already told him all this over the dinner table, and I couldn't work out why he was asking me again. Pretending I'd not heard meant I didn't have to answer a question that didn't make sense to me. "Oi, cloth ears, what's with the mad ass face?" I looked up at him then. "Come on, cheer up, lad, it might never happen." In the Meltdowns video I made not so long ago, I mentioned that an innocuous phrase just like that could trigger a meltdown. Well, it actually did. On that day, it was the spark that lit my emotional torch, the final straw that broke my mental camel's back, the bullet to the Archduke of my well-being. The plates I was holding crashed to the floor as my grip relaxed, and I emptied my lungs in a bellowing roar that got the neighbours gossiping. I swore and shouted whilst the tendons on my neck stood out like Lou Ferrigno in The Incredible Hulk as a voice described to me as demonic tore my family to pieces. I ripped into insecurities they didn't know they had with language they barely understood, and at a tremendous volume for the little squirt I was back then. I was told I said unforgivable things and revealed secrets that nobody needed or wanted to know. My meltdowns have always been more verbal than physical, but I still managed to do more damage than just dropping a few plates. Somehow my shin connected with one of the hardwood legs of the dining table and cracked it, sending the table and all the rest of the remains of our dinner crashing to the floor in a tsunami of crockery and congealed gravy. The bruise I got from that had me limping for days and took weeks to disappear. The wounds to my soul lasted decades. It was not my finest moment. That's all the relevant details of the day for our triad purposes. How my family reacted from that point doesn't matter. We're analysing the before, not the after. Once a stress event is set in motion, it has to run its course, but we don't deal with meltdowns, we deal with the causes of meltdowns. How do we really know what actually causes them for us, though? For me or for you? Some people might think I was triggered by what my dad said. Others might think it was an overload. People are quite comfortable with the idea of overloads where autism is concerned. But overload of what? How do I know what was overloading and how it got overloaded? If I can't say with any certainty what the causes of that meltdown were, how realistic are my chances of changing my approach or that of the people around me to avoid it happening again? That's why I needed the Triad of Distinction, and maybe you do too. It's the Triad that helped me work all that out. Before I start the analysis, though, Autistic still exists after 6 years on YouTube because of the support of my patrons on Patreon. I do everything on this channel myself, and it's my only source of income. I don't stick in intrusive ads every 2 minutes or take on sponsors that might rip my viewers off, but I do need to pay the rent. So, if you like what I do here and would like to see me keep doing it, please consider heading over to Patreon and pledging something to help keep the lights on here. There's also a thanks button on YouTube and a Ko-fi link if you'd rather send me a one-off tip. Every contribution goes towards making this happen, and links are all in the description. Not everyone will feel the need to write anything down when they're applying the triad, but for the purposes of explaining it, I kind of have to. So, if I was going to get pen and paper out, I'd mark 4 columns. Why not 3? It's a triad, after all. Well, we need a totals column, the flood column. Every time we add a point in one of the triad columns, we add 1 in the flood column too, to assess our overall load. We'll mark the columns E for emotional stress, S for sensory stress, and V for veracity. We're using the triad here to map out the day and pinpoint everything that might have contributed to the meltdown I had, everything that was in some way autistic. There were loads of difficulties for me on that day, so was it just a case of too much of everything all at once? Or was there something more specific going on? Although there's more that the Triad of Distinction can do for us, learning how to take back some control of our stress levels, especially when they push us over the edge, is the first step. If we can identify the flashpoints, we can choose strategies to avoid or mitigate them in future, or at least learn to recognise warning signs. Sometimes what we learn is that we couldn't have changed the outcome, but that's just as constructive and useful. Too much of the burden that we all carry on our shoulders, especially for those late identified autists, is internalised blame for things that weren't actually our fault, and the triad can help release us from such limiting and sometimes torturous patterns of thought. Don't think of the scoring we're going to do now as even remotely objective or measurable by anyone else's perspective or standards. When you use the triad, your perceptions are everything. It's all about you and how you feel or felt in the moment, just like my story here is all about how I actually felt in the moment. Not how guilt tells me I should have felt, or how people might want me to have felt. Being autistic means all of us have differences in similar areas of cognition, but we're still 100% unique individuals. Within those shared differences, we still vary infinitely between us, so how you actually felt about your stories is important for you to get the most out of this. As we work through the key events of that day, we'll look at how stimulated I felt each time in all 3 categories and score them all out of 5. If we were in a lot of physical pain or discomfort, we'd score highly on the S for sensory column, for instance. If our emotions get the better of us, overwhelm us, or they evaporate because of alexithymia, then we might score a 4 or 5 in the emotional E column. And feeling misled, let down, messed about, or harassed will pump up the points in the V for veracity column. Every time we add a point into one of the triad columns, we add the same amount to the flood counter. The flood is the total load of stress we're under in the moment, from all 3 sources. Stress events happen either when one of the triad factors reaches its limit or the combined load of them all together gets too much, whichever happens first. I could melt down because of a bunch of overwhelming stimuli in one triad factor, or a combination of all 3. Remember that this analysis will be all about you, so it doesn't matter if someone else might think your distress sounds silly or inappropriate. They're not feeling it. They don't need to know anyway, because this insight will be for your eyes only, unless you choose to share it. Sharing what we learn from the triad can be helpful, but we don't have to show people our workings like we did in school. They're for us alone. For us to understand how we get overwhelmed, we have to take all our feelings into account, even if no one else will. If you felt nothing, then score a 0, whatever the social implications of that might be. But if your feeling in the moment was a definite 5 out of 5, make sure to score it that way too. This is all about you and understanding your life after all. Anyway, back to my life in 1983. My day started 2 hours earlier than usual. 7:30 was normal for me on weekdays, so I woke up tired, but I was also excited, which kind of cancelled it out. My bare feet were like blocks of ice within the first hour, but I couldn't do much about that. Going back upstairs to fetch my socks and slippers would have meant trouble, so I was stuck with it. My joints kept popping as I shifted position to stop my bony back getting sore from leaning against the Victorian tiled walls of the porch, so I was definitely uncomfortable. But I wasn't in pain, I wasn't injured in any way, and there was nothing about my discomfort that wouldn't be felt by someone who wasn't autistic, so no points for sensory. But when the postie slipped a bunch of utility bills through the letterbox and no parcel with a Doctor Who technical manual in it, I was gutted. Whilst I can say with hindsight that my disappointment may have been disproportionate, at the time it was palpable. This was the first time I'd ever sent away my own money in the mail expecting goods in return on a specific date, and it felt like a really big deal to me on the day. Before the internet, ordering direct from a publisher or manufacturer meant sending a cheque in the post, usually with an order form cut out of a magazine ad, then waiting up to 28 days for delivery. So when I saw the postie's shadow retreating after shoving nothing but a pile of brown envelopes through the door, I was mightily peeved. So, does this mean I should put points in the emotion column? Well, it depends on why I was so hugely disappointed and angry. Was it a spontaneous feeling? Or an inappropriate one? Or did it have a clearly defined cause? If there is a cause, it doesn't have to be one that non-autistic people might be sympathetic to. It doesn't matter if someone else gets it, because this isn't for them. It's for you, or me in the case we're talking about. Down in the small print of the coupon I'd sent away, it clearly said I should allow up to 28 days for delivery. Up to 28 days. But this had been day 29. I had been led to believe in a future which had not come to pass, so my veracity was being challenged. Because of that, we use that emotional intensity to help us decide our score for the veracity column. We add to our veracity column whenever we're challenged by things that don't work or behave the way they should, and few things in existence are better at defying the odds than people not meaning or doing what they say. Most of our veracity stress points come from people, whether it be through lies, flattery, broken promises, or causing chaos where there should be order. It can come from non-human sources too, though. We can get just as vexed if our neatly ordered filing system or our latest Warhammer 40k diorama gets messed up by an earthquake as by a human with a grudge. Veracity is how we quantify truthfulness, adherence to the facts, logical choices, and so on, but also how chaotic and disordered we're made to feel. Anything or anyone who deceives, misrepresents, contradicts, or destroys without cause scores highly in the veracity column. The publisher not getting my book to me on time wasn't in the same league as a face-to-face confrontation, or an earthquake. So it doesn't get full marks for veracity, but it put a massive dent in my day right at the start, so I'm giving it 4 out of 5. And adding the same to the flood column too, of course. The next incident on our list was the bathroom being blocked. On a normal day, there'd have been no one in there at 7:45 when the post finally arrived, but on this day, my younger sibling, who normally had to be nagged to go anywhere near the bathroom, was hogging it and refusing to hurry up. Stick 3 in the veracity column for that one for the disruption to my routine, and 2 in the sensory, which makes 5 in the flood. Because I was behind, I rushed my bathroom routine and left the house several minutes late. My teenage thighs pumped like pistons to get me and my bike to school on time, but I failed and arrived a hot, stinking, sweaty mess of adolescent flesh and frustration with a fresh detention slip for my efforts. Being late means failure to live up to an expectation, and I probably hate letting people down more than I fear being let down myself. Being unable to fulfill my obligations vexes me at least as much as someone breaking a promise to me, so 3 points there for being late. My internalised anger at that is disproportionate to what I'm told is normal, so it's not just the confusion of mismatched information. It provokes a distinctly autistic emotional reaction too. I had every reason to be anxious at being late, but the frenetic panic and subsequent fretting throughout the day was distinctly autistic and earns 3 emotion points. One of my autistic quirks is a heightened awareness of biological smells. Doesn't matter what they are, if it's a smell that comes out of a living or dead thing, I sense it acutely, and in many cases I find them stomach-churning. Even though nobody else commented on it on the day, I was very conscious of my personal odour throughout thanks to that bike ride, which contributed, albeit in a low-key fashion, to my overall burden, to the flood. I'll stick 2 in the sensory column for that. I was self-conscious, but not mortally shamed by it. Next on the list was my lunch being stolen and jammed at the top of the school flagpole. The only way to get it down would be for someone, me, to climb up and retrieve it. I knew if I told a staff member I'd never hear the end of it and that I wouldn't stand a chance of fetching it down myself. So I went without my lunch. But one of my sensory quirks is that I rarely feel hunger, so missing lunch didn't cause me any physical discomfort. However, it was a significant inconvenience to my routine, worth 3 points in the veracity column. The disruption wasn't the reason I was already crying before I even reached the secret spot round the back of the PE block where I'd hide for the next couple of hours. Emotionally, I put this moment at a 4. It's not the worst I've ever felt, especially after 40 more years to put it into perspective, but it was a horrible feeling. It wasn't embarrassment or humiliation. It was loneliness and disappointment. I felt so sad and unworthy that the only way my peers seemed able to relate to me was through cruelty, something I never ever reciprocated, yet they seemed to delight in tormenting me. I cried because my feelings had been hurt by bullies. They set out to cause pain, and they succeeded. I felt indignant and resentful. I plotted and schemed, not of revenge or retribution, but for my vindication. I tried to think of ways I might prove my worth and earn their respect, rather than hurt them back for having hurt me. But I'm also giving it a 5 for veracity. The initial pain of rejection gradually gave way to the resentment of being betrayed, lied to and cheated, as well as abused. It was already a familiar feeling and one I'd returned to throughout my life. I tried to follow all the rules I was told, from the written to the unspoken, and yet still got bullied mercilessly. My sense of injustice was through the roof. I'll just recap that, just in case it looks like I've scored the same thing twice. I added veracity points for my lunch being stolen because it messed up my routine completely, not just for lunchtime, but the rest of the day, it turned out. Rather than confront it, knowing I would fail, I found somewhere to be alone instead, to weep and lick my wounds, which I scored highly for emotions. It was only after sitting there for a while that I started to process the power imbalance and the injustice of what happened, so I've scored additional veracity points for that. I wouldn't have felt that way without the incident, but it was well after the event and separate to my initial feelings of inconvenience. It added to the load, to the flood. From a non-autistic perspective, it may look like one issue, but that wasn't my experience. From my perspective, the lunchbox incident gave way to the hiding and crying incident, and so they're scored separately. Once I brushed myself down and headed back to class, it didn't take me long to get sent out again. I'd had plenty of similar dealings with this teacher before, and he made no secret of his dislike for me. Although he'd swept the corridor for chairs, I was quite content to read my book standing up, and had I not been so rudely interrupted, would have just stood there quietly reading until the final bell. The confiscation of my book alone would have scored maybe 2 in the V for veracity scale, plus 2 in the senses for the dull, uncomfortable wait in the corridor afterwards. But then there was the glee in the teacher's face when he thought he'd got one over on me. That felt unnecessary and spiteful, so the veracity score goes up from 2 to 4, which, with those 2 emotion points, makes a total of 6 in the flood column. My tyre getting punctured on the journey home was nobody's fault. It was just bad luck, but it got in the way and slowed me down on a day I'd already been delayed and messed about, so I have to give it at least a 3 for veracity. I was young and fit, but also annoyed at everyone and everything that had frustrated my day, and impatient to get home, so I'll pop 3 in the emotions column too. The next thing to consider was so low-key you might be forgiven for ignoring it, but it was possibly the worst moment up until that point. Getting home after the day I'd had and finding out that there hadn't even been a second post dashed all my hopes of losing myself in the details and designs of my favourite sci-fi show. I'm marking my disappointment high in both the veracity and the emotional columns. It had been a horrible day, and that hope that my book would have come whilst I was out had been keeping me going all day. Its failure to arrive not only left me feeling flat and empty, it felt like a letdown. I'd been patient, and it still wasn't here. 5 for veracity for the initial shock, and for the deeply disappointed brooding that followed, 4 in the emotions. So, this brings us up to the moment of the meltdown itself. It's not easy scoring stress events, shutdowns, or in this case, a meltdown, because the emotional component is always a full 5 points, at least at the tipping point just before the floodgates open. Knowing why we're overloading in the moment won't save us, because rationality and control aren't our strong points right then. But it's what might save us from getting into a pickle next time, because there's always a next time. There was nothing sensory going on at the trigger moment, nothing notable. My meal had been okay, and I was just doing my regular task of clearing the dinner table. My emotions suddenly rose as I went into meltdown mode, but were they spontaneous or were they prompted? What was it about what my dad said that triggered me? We're not pretending that my meltdown was a rational or even appropriate response, but even so, there needs to be an action for there to be a reaction, and that's what we're looking for. I'd told my dad about my awful day during dinner because he asked. He knew everything that had happened, knew I was feeling down and resentful at the bullying I'd received at school from all sides, yet he still came out with that glib comment, acting like he didn't know why I might be unhappy. The way I felt then, it was like he'd either pretended to listen to me or it was a ploy to minimise my distress, to trivialise it. And that was the final straw this time. It was a veracity pin that popped my meltdown bubble that day. Misunderstandings of my mood may be a very autistic stress, but it happened every day, so I can't score it highly. It was a trivial comment and only worth 2 out of 5 veracity points on a normal day. But that day, it was the catalyst for a meltdown of epic proportions. I'm in my 50s now, and I know people a lot better. I know myself a lot better, thanks in part to this triad of mine. I know what was going on that day from my dad's side now. It was one of those things we got to share before he died, and I'm glad we did. But I didn't know any of that back in 1983, so it didn't count back then. Why did I melt down? Let's look at the numbers. Remember, you don't have to use numbers if they don't work for you, but you need a way of keeping count, so to speak. As I said earlier, if there's enough interest, I'll discuss alternatives to numbers in a future video, but we'll stick to numbers for today though, because they are easier for most folks to relate to. Out of a total score of 52 in the flood column, only 6 points came from distinctly autistic sensory discomfort, with more than double that in the emotional column. But our faraway winner in the 1983 Quinn's Meltdown Challenge, with 32 autistic stress points, is veracity. The main reason I fell to pieces on that day wasn't sensory stress or emotional overload. It was informational inconsistency more than anything else that did for me. Being lied to, misled, misjudged, misrepresented, mistreated, or things just not working how they're supposed to. It was the source of my stress, it was what hurt me the most, and that's why I melted down. My book didn't turn up when promised, my routine was disrupted multiple times, I was bullied by my fellow pupils and a teacher, I missed lunch, got sent out of class, my book was confiscated, my tyre blew, I got disappointed by the lack of a second post, and, despite explaining it all over dinner, my dad still verbally poked and prodded at me because he didn't like the look on my face. My veracity had been stretched to its limit, and his comment tipped me over. I've mapped out every meltdown and shutdown I can remember using my personal variant of that same scoring system, and it didn't take me long to find a pattern. Whilst sensory stresses always feature and have taken a bigger role in later life, by far the biggest factor in most of my past stress events is usually the V factor, my veracity. A few times, my emotions have got the better of me without informational discrepancies being involved, but rarely are my melty or shutty downy moments primarily sensory in nature. That might not be the same for you. The first 2 people I shared this with identified sensory issues as their prime factor, and the next one, emotions, and so on and so on. But it doesn't matter what you find, nor whether it matches your expectations. It's that you find an answer that can help you take control of your life. The stress event, the meltdown that we discussed today, is pretty typical in the way it scores for me. My threshold for stress events seems to lie around a flood score, a total of 50 to 80, or an individual triad score of 30 to 40 in any single factor. I know that if my emotional or veracity scores were to get close to the 30 mark, or everything combined got to around 50, I'd need to do something there and then to avoid being pushed too far. Or there will be consequences. Loud and nasty, or quiet and worrying consequences we can't predict, but either way, consequences I'd rather avoid. Our thresholds aren't fixed in place, though, because our lives aren't fixed either. The world is constantly changing and moving around us, and we do our best to shift with the tides, but there will always be days where we start off with a shorter fuse than usual, and so we might reach that point of no return a little quicker some days than others. Using the Triad of Distinction to analyse my past stress events has allowed me to predict and avoid them pretty effectively. I've coped a lot better with life in general now. I've less need to worry about losing my cool when it all gets too much. Whilst I've mentioned and briefly described the autistic triad of distinction before, this is the first time I've tried to explain it in detail, so I really hope it makes sense to you. I've been using this framework to make sense of my own life and to help others do the same for years. This was by no means a comprehensive breakdown, just an introduction. Next time we talk about the triad of distinction, we'll go into the first leaf in depth. We'll talk about the emotional stresses that come with being autistic and the disconnections and mishaps associated with them. In a few weeks' time, I'll work through some real events in other autists' lives to help you get a better picture of how it works in practice and what the triad can do for you. I've a couple of cases to be going on with, but I'll also be opening it up to viewers sometime later in this year. So, until next time, I'm Quinn, and I'm autistic. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.